In our first class, we decided we needed to define the term worship before we got into the actual book. So in studying what worship is, we found out that in America there are actually 4 forms of corporate worship. There's liturgical, non-liturgical, informal, and private. The liturgical is a set pattern of prayers and readings. They're often printed in a book to be followed by everyone in the congregation. A lot of the high churches, Episcopalian, Methodist, use a liturgical form. Everyone knows what's going to happen. There are responsive readings. They say the same prayers together. Their lesson plans are laid out ahead of time. Non-liturgical has less structure to it. The congregation can tailor the service to a specific need or time of year or whatever. The leaders do their own study and prepare their own lessons, and song leaders choose their own songs. Informal worship is more free-flowing with no set pattern or style to an individual worship time. A lot of house churches are more informal in their worship. And of course, private worship is one-on-one. And it can be liturgical, non-liturgical, or informal, depending on the person and what they like, how they like to worship. But there's far more to worship than just the form of worship that happens in corporate worship. So we want to look at how the Bible describes worship. To make sure that everybody's on the same page as we study, we need to define our terms. In the Bible, there are many Hebrew, Greek, and even Aramaic words and phrases that are translated by our English word worship. They are used in reference to God and to man. So we're going to look at a few of those. The following words mean to bow down, bend the knee, prostrate, to kiss toward, like throw a kiss, to air kiss, that French thing that people do, kissing on either side of the cheek, and to kowtow. The Hebrew has a word called shakah. The Aramaic is sagad, Greek proskuneo, and also gonu. These words show the action of the person. They are showing respect for another person. They are also showing surrender to the will of another one. You notice this when one nation would conquer another, that the king of the conquered nation would bow, would actually get down flat on the ground to show that they surrender to that nation. In showing respect, often in other countries, say England for instance, people bow or curtsy to the Queen. In France, they will do the air kiss thing when they meet one another. It's a sign of your relationship to the other person. The next set of words refers to serving or ministering to one another. Abad is the Hebrew word, latro is a Greek word, and a third one, therapeuo, from which we get therapeutic, is also Greek. And these words all apply to serving God and to serving man. Laturo is probably the most often used word in the New Testament. Kara is a Hebrew word. It means to call, to proclaim, to cry out, to choose, to name. It expresses ownership or relationship. So with the Hebrew word kara, to call, that's a really interesting word that we'll get into a little bit more as we go along. But the fact that you name something, as Adam named the woman Eve, it expresses his relationship to her. You name your child, this is my child. They take on the family name. It shows who they belong to. And it is also translated worship in some English translations, depending on the context. And then, of course, you have the English word worship, which comes from an Old English word, which simply means worthiness or respect, worth-ship. And so when we worship, we are expressing the worth of the object or the person that we are worshiping. So putting it all together, worship shows respect, but ultimately it shows our surrendering our will to God. And two great examples of this happen in Genesis 22, when Abraham bent his will to the will of God in offering Isaac as a sacrifice. And in Luke 22, when Jesus is in the garden and he bends his will to the will of the Father. This is worship. Worship is seen in service to God by serving others. I believe it was Paul who said, God doesn't need to be served by man's hands. But as Jesus said, if you offer a cup of cold water to someone, then you have served me. So our service to other people, our taking care of other people, is our service to God. And worship is also expressing our relationship to God. Back in Genesis 4:26, it says that Seth had a son. He named that son Enosh, and that is when men began to worship God as Jehovah. When they began to call on his name, when they began to say, this is my God, and we are his people. That happened way back in Genesis 4. When you think about calling out to God, which happens often in the Old Testament and the New Testament, the people are calling out to their God. They have a relationship to him. All the way through the Old Testament, our Father is referred to as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He was their God, and he was their people, or they were his people. That is also worship. It is expressing the worth, the value, the characteristics of our God. And we want to keep these things in mind as we go through our book. The book that we're going to be studying is going to cover what we traditionally call the 5 acts of worship. And the way they've laid it out is the first lesson will be about the Old Testament counterpart, and the second lesson will be about what happens in the New Testament. And we want to look at these things. We want to look at why we do them, and what they express, and how they fit into the biblical definition of what worship is. So join us on Wednesday. We meet at 10 o'clock at the Red Boiling Springs Church Fellowship Hall. We would love to have you be there for this series of lessons. There'll be about 10 more lessons, possibly 11, in this series. And that's our notes for our first lesson. Love you, ladies. Bye.
On bended knee I come, with a humble heart I come, bowing down before your holy throne. lifting holy hands to you, as I pledge my love anew. I worship you in spirit, I worship you in truth. Make my life